Hi everyone, today we have to talk about rendering. We are going to be doing some lighting and scene setup in our next few videos, and of course from here on out. But before we get there, we need to talk about what the heck rendering is. So in here we're going to talk about the different render engines that we have and where these are utilized. So to start out with, if you go over here to where you see this thing that looks like a little camera, it will show you it's the render properties. If you go over here, you see render engine. We have Eevee, Workbench, and Cycles. Those are our three that we have in here by default. And so these are going to be the different pieces of software that have been created to take our scene, the geometry of our elements that we're creating, the textures that we placed on them, the lighting, the bounces of the lighting, the colors that are being reflected from the objects to the other objects. That data will be gathered and turned into a 2D image. Now, the difference between the different rendering engines is how much of that data are they going to include. So let me give you the quick 1, 2, 3 over these. Eevee is really nice looking, not quite as good as Cycles. So here's our first and our main two. Eevee, really, really great looking. Cycles, it's going to be best for your higher end publications. Why does Eevee exist if Cycles is better? Eevee gets done in pretty much real time. Cycles can take minutes, multiple seconds, maybe days, depending upon what you're trying to do. Remember, you might be rendering into an image a publication that's just going to go on a website. You could also be rendering multiple images that you're going to make into some type of animation. The last one on here is Workbench, and that one doesn't get talked about terribly too much, but that is the Workbench that we see by default when we go here. When we're looking at our little cube and it's just this kind of gray color in this world, this is Workbench. So the Workbench render engine. Now, those are the three, and what I'm talking about right now is a perfect segue to go into my next section. What I just implied is slightly inaccurate. Well, implied. Going to layout mode or modeling looks like this, but you notice real quickly when I was talking, I clicked up here to make it look gray. By default, when you install Blender, when you go into layout mode, it changes this to solid shading, right? Remember our wireframe and solid that we've been bouncing back and forth between. Solid shading uses the Workbench render image by default, okay? So it would be incorrect to say that layout uses Workbench. Layout uses by default solid shading uses Workbench render engine. When I go to shading, by default, it changes over to Material Preview, also known as LookDev. LookDev Material Preview uses Eevee as the render engine. So right now, all the time in the last video when we were making our textures here and playing with our nodes, we're looking at Eevee. Okay. Now the next one here, rendered, this one depends upon which one you have selected here as your render engine. So a typical thing, at least for me and many people, is we leave everything else maybe as its defaults, but we change this one to Cycles. So I can go Eevee here if I want to see it real quickly and get kind of a pretty decent idea on what my cube is going to look like in a scene. But if I want it to see it as it's really going to be, I leave this as Cycles, and I go here and I change the viewport shading to rendered. And now I see it in Cycles. Then the probably immediate concern here is that you look at this, after I just said Cycles is the better one and amazing possibly, it doesn't look as good as this. So this is Eevee right here, and this is Cycles. Now, better, maybe you can see this. I'm going to explain this a little bit here and see if you can see what's going on here. The shading is a bit smoother here. The light around the edge here is a bit better, but the whole thing itself, when you first look at it, just doesn't quite look as good because you're not seeing a lot of interesting contrast shadows and so on and so forth. Over here, when we go, not to Eevee specifically, but when we go to Material Preview, it comes with an HDRI that we talked about in the last one. We have this reflection going on here from some other outside object, and that outside object is casting its light. So imagine the picture, all the highlights of it, the colors of it were turned into actually an emissive light source. They are casting light onto the object. So we're getting reflections on the object from the world, and we're getting extra lighting from the world. So it looks, I guess you'd say, nice. Cycles doesn't look as nice because it's not using that HDRI. It's using the scene lights that we've added in, but we need more. We need to add more things. We could add in an HDRI and it would look really great. We could do that pretty quickly, and now it'll look better, maybe, than Eevee. But you might not want an HDRI, so you might want to add a floor. You might want to build your whole world around this. You might want to build a picnic table that this cube is sitting on. And so you do that, and then it's going to start to look amazing. So just know that that is in effect. I'd like to go back to the time that it takes. So if I move this around, you can see that this kind of gets kind of staticky as I move it around. That's because we're in cycles, and cycles takes longer to render it. It's not real time. So it does its best to try to figure it out. But I can tell you also, if I move this out of the way here, zoom out a little bit, it's actually calculating based upon this sample rate that you have over here. So whichever engine you choose, you can say, how many samples would you like it to take in the viewport here, or when you render it to an image. So when you render it to an image, it's going to take longer, 512 samples, 32 in the viewport to make it go quicker. If you look over here on the side as I move it, the interesting thing is if I let go, it looks pretty good, and then you think it's done. But watch, if I move it and I stop, it's still calculating. That goes pretty quick, but if I change this to say 200 and then I roll it around, it looks good again. It still moves just as fluidly, or not fluidly. It moves the same as it did before, but when I stop, it's still calculating. It's not done yet. That doesn't really affect us, but it's not necessary, because if I can't tell exactly right now and I want to get on to other things, that's just a needless bunch of CPU cycles that are being taken up for something I can't perceive right now. So we'll go ahead and put this back down to 32. Now, the 512, though, that will be noticeable in a time factor. So if I hit F12, this is me rendering it. So I hit F12, this is going to be our scene. This is the scene as it is viewed through the camera. Another topic down the road. How do you change this? You can absolutely change what the camera is seeing, how it looks like, and you move everything all around. So you can see this whole scene is taking a bit. Gets done eventually. Now, if I were to do that same thing, but I'll change my render engine to Eevee, looks a bit different, and then I hit F12, that's it. It's done. That's it. That wasn't like, oh, it's just showing me a preview. Is it doing something? No, it's absolutely done. So that's the difference in a small scene with just a little cube. If I added 16 more cubes here, Eevee would still be done pretty much instantaneously, whereas Cycles is going to take even longer. Then as one last thing in this overview of rendering video, I would like to mention that if you have been playing around with Blender for a little bit, poking on some buttons, it might remember certain things which cause certain things that we're doing here to look differently. Meaning, like for example, the gray background or the amount of lighting. There are some buttons I want to point out, because if you did something accidentally and if you want to follow along, I'd like you to know how to set it back. If you'd like to play with them, that's absolutely fine. So know that, let's go back over to layout mode. So I'm in solid view right now. And if I go up here to that little arrow that we hit before where we could change matte cap and we could change these things here, you can go here and change certain qualities of the workbench engine. And if you want to get even more picky, you can actually come down and change the color of the object in Workbench if you want, underneath the viewport display right here. If you want, there's some other things you have to do here. I might as well show you really fast. If you go here and you change it to object, it's going to say any specific object, that you have here, I can change the color of it. And so look at that. This is not a material. I don't have textures or anything really major on this, but I'm changing the color. So lo and behold, with the Workbench engine, you can make things different colors. You want to know how to set this back to default. So pick it in the center here. You'll notice saturation. If you just drag that down to 0, then you should be good again. But anyways, that's a thing you can do there. If I pick on Material Preview, I see it as the color that we made in our material using nodes. If you hit the drop-down arrow again, we don't get those same items that we saw before. So each one, here look at wireframe, it has its own set of options up here as well. So if I go back to Material Preview, which is looking at Eevee, if I would like to see the scene lights, which you probably would like to see the scene lights, you can. But if you'd like to turn them off, you see the lights just went away. If you don't see anything on here, you might have messed around with this. So that's our scene lights. Now there's also a scene world, and this one here is something you might turn off, but there's another thing you can do later I'll talk about in the next video. There's a secret light. There's the world light. And if I turn it off, now it gets really dark. What you're seeing is just the cube as it would be in the blackness of space if you added 3 little point lights out here to reflect on. This will be a big deal when you're setting up lighting. It's important to know how to turn on and off all your extra support lights so you can end up getting the scene you want rather than struggling with why did I turn all my lights off but I'm still seeing stuff. Let me show you that real fast. Here's all my lights over here. Click, click, click. All my lights that I added in are gone. So why do I still see a cube? That's because this. It's going to do something a little bit weird because the light that is put onto the cube is what this is about, not the light that you see in the gray in the background. So if I turn this off, there's no more light on that cube. Okay, so good enough for that for right now. And I'll turn my lights back on. Now, if I go to rendered, I can hit the drop down and I've got the same thing as well. So just know if it doesn't look the same, that's a place where you could go to set things to make them look a little bit more correct. Then with that, we'll call this video complete. Rendering is a really complex topic. There is a lot of different little buttons and check marks and sliders that you can use to try to make your renders as good as possible. And we will pick those up over time. But right now, just as an overview, just to talk about what are the basics, hopefully we accomplish that with this.